Welcome everyone to a new edition of Makdisi Street. Today we're delighted to have with us Hadeel Assali. Hadeel is an anthropologist and a former chemical engineer. Hadeel's research focuses on Gaza, southern Palestine, obviously, and intimate relations between the people and the land, and how this relationship forms a bulwark against colonial violence. Hadeel has researched secret population transfer schemes from Gaza that we'll talk about a little later in this podcast. She's also worked on the tunnels of Gaza, their history and their meaning. She's also talked about different forms of resistance, including mutual aid efforts in the face of the current genocide in Gaza. And she's now focusing on the potential role of clay in the remediation of military contamination. Hadeel is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Science and Society and a lecturer in the Department of Earth and Environmental Studies at Sciences, at Columbia University, which of course is now in the news, where she teaches a seminar entitled Science Underground Decolonial Methods. Hadeel, it's a huge pleasure and honor for us to have you on with us on Makdisi Street, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a huge honor to be part of your podcast.
Okay, so Hadeel, obviously you're at Columbia, you're in New York, I understand. Um, can you just give us a sense of, since we just had the breaking news yesterday and today, this awful story of the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian green card holder, by the Trump administration. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the situation is like there before we get into your work and some questions about your work? First of all, how are you? How you're coping, and what's the situation like there?
Sure. It's a very somber morning today. We learned 2 nights ago that Department of Homeland Security came into the building, detained him in front of his pregnant wife, and we're unaware that he had a green card at the time. I guess they thought he was on a student visa. And now, as you know by now, Mark Rubio is talking about revoking his green card and lodging accusations of somehow supporting Hamas, which they have deemed a terrorist group. The last we've heard is that he's been shipped to Louisiana to the Gina LaSalle facility, and no one has been able to reach him. Not his lawyer, not his wife, nobody. So there's also been not accusations, there's been warnings from other students' lawyers of more ICE raids coming to campus. So we've been urged to stay off campus, although many of us are in Columbia housing, which is also not safe. So we're all a little bit on edge, upset, angry that the university hasn't even made a statement about this, and actively organizing and trying to figure out what to do next.
So the university, Hadeel, hasn't issued any statement whatsoever about the arrest of one of its students. Nothing.
No, no statement whatsoever. I mean, this is how they've been operating since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza. Not a single statement about what's been happening there. Everything has been couched in terms of anti Semitism and having Jewish students feel safe on campus. All of the protests, all of the sit ins have been nonviolent, of course, and these have been deemed as threatening to Jewish students, when in fact half of the encampments were Jewish students. Half of my students are Jewish students. So it's only obviously catering to Zionist students and faculty and surrounding community members who have been actively advocating for these measures to be taken against our community.
It's really, honestly, Hadeel, it's extraordinary. It's so upsetting. It's so infuriating, as well as depressing and chilling. There was a news report in, I think it was the Dropsite News, I think, about Columbia University also having an office that's there, sort of helping spy on students, or inform on students. Do you know anything about that as well?
I don't know details because whatever they're doing, they're keeping secret. But we have received information in the past about public safety departments working with law enforcement, of course, and possibly even collaborating with Israeli agencies of some sort. So, just this morning, someone sent a picture of a large vehicle parked off 116th Street, which is the main street near campus. And it looked like there was all kinds of equipment in the back that someone identified as phone call intercepting equipment. So we're in a state of full surveillance. We know that there's Israeli technology, facial recognition cameras all over campus. None of us are feeling safe.
What's happening is it's truly, I mean, it's not just I mean, of course, Colombia is very, very bad, but it's not just at Colombia. I mean, it's across the entire country. Here at UCLA, it's also extremely bad, and it's the same narrative of anti-Semitism that's being used to justify all this stuff, even though at least in the case of UCLA, all of the particular stories of so-called anti-Semitic incidents have been debunked again and again and again. They've just taken on a life of their own. I've told my brothers it's like this is like a zombie narrative. It's like the undead. It's going to go on even though it's been killed 100 times. It keeps coming back. And as you're saying, Hadid, the most amazing thing is that so many of the participants in the encampment and the protests generally are in fact Jewish anti-Zionists. So it's not like the lines are not Jewish, not Jewish. The lines are Zionist and anti-Zionist, right? And that's or pro-genocide and anti-genocide. I mean, that's the other way of thinking about it. What to me the most amazing thing is, and we're seeing Colombia, implode in a way. And I've heard about gates being closed to Colombia and just a situation of just like it's I don't know. It sounds like a snake pit to me. um, the most amazing thing is to see all of this incredible repression in support. People keep saying this is it's Trumpian fascism or whatever. The important thing is that fascism or despotism, authoritarianism, and so forth, things like McCarthy in the U.S. in the 1950s, those were all designed allegedly. They weren't really, but they allegedly to protect the interests of the country where the repression was taking place. As far as I know, this is the first time in history where the liberties of one country and of a great power at that are being suppressed to protect a whole other country. It's truly extraordinary. It's like imagine in the 19th century, some little principality in India basically having the rights of British subjects in London taken away. It's this is what we're talking about here. It's truly extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this didn't start with Trump. We know that. The gates were closed before Trump came to office. The repression happened under Biden's administration. Now there's a lawsuit from the local community, like the neighbors around Columbia. They're suing about the closure of the gates because it's a thoroughway. It's actually part of 116th Street, and people that have mobility issues depend on that to get across, rather than having to go around the whole campus. This whole anti-Semitism narrative has been exploded in many areas, and it's become evident how deeply embedded Zionist interests are in institutions, not just universities, but arts institutions, nonprofits. People from all walks of life have sort of woken up to the fact that all of our freedom of speech has been curtailed for the sake of the state of Israel, which is really just, yeah, as you said, really something extraordinary.
It is extraordinary, Hadil, and really like this whole question of trying to sort of surveil, as you said, people at Colombia and across this country now for their for their actual sort of constitutional rights of speaking out and so on and so forth. That takes us to actually, in a sense, it relates to some of your work. You've done a lot of work, Hadil, on the question of tunnels, and you've worked about the tunnels. You've written about your experience in the tunnels. You have a new article which we'll link in the show description below about in the Arab Studies Quarterly about the tunnels. So most people, of course, have no. They just hear about tunnels in terms of what's happened in Gaza over the last 15 months. But can you give us just very briefly a sense of the history of these tunnels in Gaza, when they began, why they began, how they function, and why are tunnels important? And above all, I guess, why are they so difficult for the Israelis to actually discover? There's a lot of questions, but basically about tunnels.
Sure. Interesting. Gaza has a very long history with tunnels. Like there's been tunnels discovered from, 2,000 years ago. There's something about the soils of Gaza that makes it conducive to tunneling. It has very clay-rich soils that allow for clandestine digging, as opposed to, say, the West Bank's mountainous region where it's more rocky and you would need explosives. So there's actually a very long, rich history of tunnels in Gaza, like from the time of Alexander the Great's conquering and so on. But in these modern tunnels, if we talk about the ones, particularly the ones in the border at Rafah, those emerged roughly around the time that Israel fully pulled out of the Sinai Peninsula. After the Camp David Accord in 1979, they were given 3 years to complete their pullout. And so in 1982 was the first time that a fence actually went up splitting Rafah in two, because by then the old city of Rafah had grown quite large over the past several decades, and so the city was split, which means families and relationships between friends and families were split, and this was really the reason why tunneling began, was so people could reach each other. And the stories go that the first tunnel was actually a municipal pipe that happened to be under this border. There's also stories of dogs digging under the fence. But in terms of like people digging to each other, yeah, it began primarily between homes, between families who were trying to reach each other. And, kind of this is before the days of Google Earth. So, people would send signals to each other across the border and tell each other how, what direction to go in order to reach their house. And so a lot of it began, primarily to keep contact, primarily for trade regions. Another important thing to understand about this particular point in geography is that the path that goes through Gaza is an ancient one that has a long, long history of trade and pilgrimage routes and so on. So it's a very well-worn pathway. And these relations of trade and travel have been there for centuries, really. So it just made sense, if you think about it, that tunnels would emerge when that road was cut off. So it began that way. It began people just, trying to reach each other, continuing trade, illicit trade and regular trade. And then, of course, when Hamas came to power and the siege tightened, then the tunnels really proliferated. And Hamas even created a ministry to manage the tunnels, complete with permitting processes, and it was a full operation. And of course, once Sisi came to power in Egypt, that the game changed completely. Whereas before Sisi, it was sort of a public secret that Mubarak and I always forget the other guy's name, the Muslim Brotherhood Egyptian leader.
Morsi.
Morsi, thank you. Uh, so, so basically, once Sisi came to power, the policies towards the tunnel changed completely. Whereas Morsi and before him, of course, Mubarak had turned a blind eye, knowing they knew full well about the tunnels. Now, why they can't detect the tunnels? There is no technology to find tunnels, and I've been researching this and following this for a very long time. There's been a lot of claims made about secret technologies being developed, but as we saw in the past several months, the tunnels have not been conquered. There's simply no technology to see through the ground. There's some technology to detect maybe shallow grave sites that archaeologists use, but even that is quite shaky. So it's just, it really just says something about both the materiality itself of the land, that you just cannot, you don't have X-ray vision, you can't see through the ground. And of course, the relationship and the deep knowledge that people have had with this land, knowing where the clay layers are, because, there's a long history of pottery in Gaza. So people know where to dig for clay. And, in my mind, I thought, well, it's very sandy, it's very close to the beach, it's a coastal area. But in my interviews with people, I discovered that they just know how far to move away from the coast, how deep to go down, and then you hit sort of the clay layers of the earth.
Dear, just I want to follow up on this. You in your article and what you just described is actually really fascinating. The question of the tunnels, in particular, I just also wanted to ask you about these ancient tunnels. I mean, when we think, or when we're always hearing, about Gaza and the tunnels, obviously it's always about Hamas. It's about terrorism. It's about even smuggling in this very contemporary kind of form. But the idea that it goes back to as you were saying, between the kind of fights between the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians, and then the Gaza seaport also serving as the end of this land route between from Arabia to the Mediterranean Sea. It opens up even through this genocide, this ancient history of Gaza that many people I think discovered, for example, through the churches as well, that there are these kinds of very old I don't think people even knew there were Christians in Gaza, but that there were all these very ancient churches and now this kind of very, very old history that the tunnels and other parts of the history kind of expose. I thought that was something, something that was really very, very interesting to kind of to bring up. You mentioned as well that it's not just in Rafah, because me included, I think most of us think of the tunnels only in the kind of Rafah area, but you make the point that it's across various parts and that there's kind of very famous, infamous attacks that happen. Can you just describe where the tunnels are in relation to the geography of Gaza?
Well, I mean, I don't know, to be honest. I mean, this is, there's a principle that I work with called knowing what not to know. So I know the smuggling tunnels that are in Rafah, but of course there's the resistance tunnels that extend all over the Gaza Strip. And I do not dare to, attempt to see them or visit them or anything like that the times that I have been in Gaza. But there are Al Jazeera specials and other documentaries that talk about them. And there's of course the information that Qassam and these other groups put out themselves. Most notably, I think, is the Nahl Oz tunnel operation. Nahl Oz is North Gaza. It's just in the very northern part of the Gaza Strip, and Nahl Oz is basically this. It's both a military outpost. It's also a community that their sole purpose was to keep Palestinians from returning to their lands. The majority of people in Gaza are refugees from the surrounding lands of the Gaza Strip. So we know that the tunnels extend as far north as Beit Lahia, Jabalia. Jabalia especially is very famous for this mountain called Jabal al-Rayis, where the potters go for their clay. In Gaza City, there's a Hayy al-Fawakhir, a neighborhood of the potters, and where they go to get their clay is this clay-rich mountain called Jabal al-Rayis. And of course, we know that Israel's fierce battles against the resistance in Jabalia this time. And a lot of that was enabled in large part because of their tunnels, right? And so the tunnels extend throughout the Gaza Strip. There's, of course, rumors of an entire underground metropolis. We won't know for sure hopefully until Palestine is liberated, and then we will hopefully know the full breadth of these tunnels, as we learned about the Kuchi tunnels after the Vietnam War was over.
I was going to say it's some future when there'll be sort of tunnel museums, kind of like what Hezbollah has in the south of Lebanon now, actually, to after the liberation to show what the modalities were for tunnel warfare. But Hadeel, just before we come back to the tunnels, the contemporary tunnels, just to underscore one of the points you make in the pieces we read in preparation for this, one of the amazing things that we don't. So many of us forget that Gaza is not just this dumping ground for refugees, just how it's often depicted in the West, but this ancient site and crossroads between Asia and Africa, most obviously, a place where, Ramses II went when he wanted to attack what's now, Syria and so forth. And I mean, it's the depth to Gaza is truly incredible. The cultural depth, the historical depth. We often forget about this. I want to just mention, by the way, that our cousin Farid Armali, who's an artist based in Germany, has a whole exhibition about that he mounted in a museum in Geneva about pottery shards that turned up. They were excavated in an excavation in Geneva for construction. They came across these shards. Turns out that they came from an amphora that was originally from Gaza, I don't know, a couple thousand years ago or something. So it's kind of amazing how Gaza is kind of at the heart of so many different currents, historically speaking, not just now. But to come back to the tunnels themselves, clearly in military terms, they're very effective. And one of the reasons they're effective is that, as you say, there's no technology to detect them. And the other reason is once the Israelis find them, the only way to deal with them is to actually send soldiers into them, which of course they don't do because they're terrified. Which I think is a really that's one of the differences between the tunnel warfare in Gaza and the experience in the Vietnamese War of Liberation against the U.S. in the 1960s, in particular in Cu Chi, because the Americans did send specialized soldiers into the tunnels when they found them in Cu Chi. So I don't know just to think about the limits, we often think about Israeli omnipotence in various kinds of ways, and here we come up against two forms of limitation in Israeli technological and military terms: the inability to discover tunnels and the inability to actually enter them, to to explore them on foot, because that's really ultimately what it would take to map them out properly, and so forth, from a either political or military point of view. Just what do you think about these incredible limitations that we see in the occupying power?
Well, I think it's important to highlight them because, as you said, there is this narrative of Israeli omnipotence. Of course, October 7th shattered that view. But even before that, if you paid attention to what the resistance was doing or the ways that they were trying to communicate to the outside world, um, there, especially like in the Nahal Oz operation, it was very evident that they're very well versed in the technologies Israel has. They're well versed in their surveillance apparatus. They Before even doing the Nahal Oz operation, they had conducted several reconnaissance missions. And this is a very heavily surveilled space, especially the Gaza border. This border, it's not a border. And so again, just taking seriously what they are saying and what they are sharing absolutely takes away from this omnipotence narrative. And also, if you pay attention to Israel's own narratives about their technologies to detect tunnels, I have a Google News alert about tunnels that I've been following for like 12 plus years. And every so often, especially like when the wars on Gaza emerge, there's been several bombardments of Gaza since 2005, of course. Every so often, it'll emerge that they have this technology that that they're combating, that they're winning, that they have the tunnels, and then the tunnels kind of come into the news and then they disappear. And it's happened again this time, if you notice. So it's just very important to pay attention to how the narrative that they put out, and then how they kind of cover it up. Um, but I want to also go back to Farid Armali. I didn't realize that was your cousin. He was a very generous and kind person to me when I started my PhD work. And I was also very taken by this deep history of Gaza. Gaza, one of my sort of a very, very early piece that I wrote, I call the hyper presence of Gaza. The hyper absent presence of Gaza, the hyper present absence of Gaza. And what I mean by that is that Gaza is very, very prominent and loud, if you will, when it comes to war discourse, when it comes to terrorism discourse, and of course, when it comes to humanitarian discourse. But as I was researching ethnographies in Gaza, any research in Gaza, even histories of Gaza, despite this very deep, rich history, it just doesn't compare to places like Jerusalem. And so that's what I meant by this hyper present absence, that it has this very, very deep, rich history, a very complex society, and yet it gets flattened into these narratives that we're all familiar with. And so this deep history of it, what's really fascinating is how many times Gaza has been, it's awful to say this, but how many times it's been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt. Even I remember reading Ibn Battuta's narrative about passing through Gaza, and I think people were dying by large numbers because of some disease that was passing through at the time. So it's this place that's been through destruction and reconstruction, for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And so it's very telling that the symbol of the city of Gaza is the phoenix.
Hadeel, I mean, you could say that about, of course, it's not just Gaza, it's the whole region. The entire Arab world, the entire Arab East, the Middle East in general, is always flattened in terms of always described in these kind of absurdly sort of one dimensional sectarian terms that flatten out all the history that you have so beautifully described in your piece on the history of Gaza. But I have a question for you in terms of what you write about in this essay in the Arab Studies Quarterly, where you're quoting another scholar saying that Palestinians have what you call the right to opacity. Can you explain what that means? What does that mean, the right to opacity?
It just, for me, it means that we have the right to reject surveillance. Surveillance in the modern terms, but also the right to reject the colonial apparatus, which seeks to make everything visible, to grasp, as Glissant describes it, to order, to categorize, to classify according to their logics. And so the writer that I cite, his name is Edouard Glissant. He's in his work, he's talking more about Creole, the language, which is sort of what they would consider a broken French. And he's arguing for the right to break the language and to reform it in a way that's not necessarily so easily discernible or understandable to standard French. And so, in the same sense, we also have this right to be seen or unseen. It's our choice. And I think, and you can see that kind of even in the operations of the resistance in terms of when they decide to reveal their operations and when they don't. And so this is, I think, a way of kind of reclaiming our own agency, taking control of our own narrative, that we don't need to always be available and open to the logics of, whether it's colonial, neoliberal ordering and discourses, that this is a way for us to reclaim what we decide to share, how we decide to share it, and to tell the narrative on our own terms.
In fact, Hadeel, one of the most striking things about your essay is that you talk about some of the mainstream sort of Western academic and non-academic coverage of the tunnel networks in Gaza, and it's as though they always, as you say, as you point out, they always sort of presumptively take the side of the Israelis. That Palestinians should be splayed open, splayed out, so that the Israelis can always investigate and see what's going on and so forth. This is a really, really important point, that you just like revealing the colonial logic, the Western colonial logic by which the indigenous needs to be made transparent and scrutinizable and sort of always being tracked and observed and measured and so on. And it's really important for people to think about that sort of terminology when they're talking about the tunnels in Gaza. They're often presented in Western, let's say, media discourse as this sort of, it's like, as though the Palestinians are cheating somehow by using tunnels. As though, why can't they? What is? And there's various things come up about the kind of the darkness of the tunnels and so forth. It's almost like it's a Western bugbear, almost, this idea that something shouldn't be immediately accessible and transparent and available to them and their Israeli friends to intercede in and obviously to transact violence onto.
Yes, I was also thinking as you were talking about this other unfortunate situation that we find ourselves kind of implicated in, and that is the humanitarian visibility that, especially in this past, say, 15 months or so, that Palestinians have found themselves in terms of sort of displaying themselves in a way that increases sort of the humanitarian aid that they might receive, that increases empathy from the West. There's been a lot of discussions and debates among Palestinians about this. Is it really worth it for us to show our dead bodies? Is it really worth it for us to sort of, this is sacred, and for us to kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of sell ourselves in this way? Like, what has it done for us to show the atrocities? And so I think even in that kind of in that world, in the humanitarian discourse where Palestinians have been very hyper visible as humanitarian subjects, there's also a conversation to be had about what it means to refuse that. And yeah, now as far as like, why do the colonial forces, why do colonial entities feel that they have the right to see and to know and to have everything on display for them? I mean, this goes way back. I mean, from anthropological, from the even the history of anthropology in terms of being able to classify and know and document. And although some of that was also in the early days of anthropology, it was also claimed to be for the sake of the native, especially, say, in the days of early American anthropology, when Franz Boas, the founder, was trying to sort of preserve these so-called disappearing Native American tribes. And so it came from maybe this kind of same humanitarian, well-meaning intention, but in the end, what happened was it kind of froze these so-called cultures into these static objects, which are kind of preserved in dioramas in the Museum of Natural History here in New York, rather than accepting and recognizing that all people and all cultures are dynamic and change. And I think this is sort of the difficulty that colonial ordering has in dealing with Native people, is that trying to freeze them into these categories that they can then contain and manage. Whereas for example, in the Israeli logic, think about the Hawiyya system, where Palestinians are ordered and and documented and surveilled according to their patrilineal line, right? Who's your father? Who's your father's father? When in fact, our relationships are much more complicated than that. They're much broader than that. And so this is part of the reason why I think it's so hard. It's impossible for them to completely contain Palestinians because, again, because of these relations that exceed not just maternal, paternal, but even like the idea of nasaib, right? Like that, you have people that are married into your family that may not be blood relatives, but you still consider them relatives. And I think this is something that these are the kinds of ways that we relate to each other that they can't quite contain and understand.
Adil, this is fascinating. I want to come back actually to the humanitarian thing, but I just want to start by asking you to come. The settler colonial framework that you use. It's always, for me, it's always interesting to come back and remind ourselves about how it is that the colonizer simply does not get, as you described so well, doesn't get the ontological relationship between people and the land, and that includes the tunnels and being able to, as you said, the choice to go underground. And I think you described at one point, even how some Hamas sort of soldiers are down in the ground, and they, there's some kind of connection with the land being underground, and that the colonizers simply can't understand it. Even when they're doing their military analysis, they simply cannot grasp it. They can't understand that relationship. And it's interesting how you conclude the piece, the article, when you say that the choice, and this is why I want to get back to the humanitarian question, because it's what do you mean exactly by they can choose not to be a subject of the humanitarian subject? What is so it's a matter of the choice itself, just having the choice, or is there some material gain as well from that, or is there a feeling that there is no material gain if people serve as humanitarian subjects? But also how you end it by talking about this kind of question of how could the colonizers ever understand? You ask. The land knows her family because the land is her family, and the question of, I have to quote you because it's amazing. You say Gazans immediately, even at the end, even during the genocide, or just when the ceasefire is called for, you say Gazans immediately turned to the land to make clay ovens in order to make bread, their basic sustenance, while the rest of the world has largely written off Gaza as a doomed death camp. The people there are already rebuilding schools, hospitals, homes. They're burying the dead, feeding each other, and sowing earth where they can. Could you just talk a little bit about more of that, because it's really quite fascinating.
Yes. So one of the things that I was really struck by that helped me kind of make sense of this is a lecture by Vine Deloria, who is a Native American scholar, who was trying to explain to the white man in this context, that because the white man, he's saying, can't understand our relationship to the land because they don't understand, because when the white man buries, especially the white Christian man buries, they bury in a coffin, they're separated from the land. Of course, the whole foundation of modernity, Western modernity, is this kind of separation of humans from nature, whereas savage people were considered in nature. And this was sort of seen as the hallmark of civilization. And so what Vine Deloria is explaining is that the reason we don't want to sell our land is because the literal first few feet of the land is literally the dust of our ancestors. And so there is this connection where it's not just that we want this land, we like this land, it's that we are actually made of this land is made of us. And this extends so easily to Palestine, right? The vast majority of Palestinians buried directly in the land have a deep, deep relationship with the land. Of course, maybe I'm a little bit intrigued by this as somebody who is diasporic, who didn't manage to have this kind of relationship with the land in Palestine, but have witnessed people like my mom, who has a farm, who over time did develop this relationship with the land, and so there's this relationship that I'm interested in, and like you said, it is kind of an ontological relationship that right, that as people are assuming that Palestinians are just sitting and waiting for humanitarian aid to come. In the middle of the genocide, Shifa Hospital was reopened, right? In the middle of the genocide, Nasser Hospital was reopened. I mean, even I was blown away. People are rebuilding already. Like there's all these estimates about how long it's going to take to rebuild, but yet people are they're living there's an expression الحياة بدها تستمر. It's like they just don't really have a choice. Life insists on continuing. And so this is, I think, part of what helps me understand, as somebody who is not subject to this sort of level of violence, like this sort of thrust to live and to do what it takes to feed, to plant, to maintain, schools. Schools have been operating through the genocide and rebuilt. So it's just this sort of will to life that has been sort of assumed not to be there in Gaza. In 2012, there was this report issued by the United Nations predicting that life would be unlivable by 2020. And again, it's just this sort of humanitarian narrative that completely removes Israel from the narrative. Israel's not mentioned once in the summary. And the way that the Gaza has been described in so many humanitarian discourses is as if these people are just completely helpless, as if they're just, sitting in their coffins waiting to die. When the few times that I was able to go to Gaza was like the complete opposite. It's a very, very lively place. I mean, ice cream shops and parties, and I mean, people are living their life. It's not to, of course, detract from the reality, the very, very grim realities, but that there is this really commendable, sort of will to live. And I hesitate to use the word resilience because that word resilience has been so abused when in the discourse about Gaza, or Palestinians would say sumud, for example. But I think we just have a lot to learn from them.
In fact, it's extraordinary, Hadeel, seeing, the day the ceasefire went into effect, or even the day before, people were already, hundreds of thousands of people were queued up on the beach road from the south to the north of Gaza, waiting to get back to their homes. And that, they rush home. There's the attachment to the land and to their home is so clear. And now, in the context of Ramadan and so forth, just seeing people carrying on all of the sort of the normal rituals of life in the most abnormal circumstances. But I think it underlies what you're talking about in terms of
Exactly the
just
same thing in southern
in
Lebanon,
South Lebanon. Yeah, yeah,
and after
exactly.
2006 especially, but even now.
And it's also commendable to know that the Israelis didn't go back, right?
No, also, but they don't understand this. Like, to them, it boggles their mind that as soon as the bombing stops, people are rushing back to their homes. They don't understand that attachment to the
Yeah, they
land and
haven't
their
gone
home.
back. They haven't gone back to their northern part. I mean, so as people have all returned as much as possible to the south here, the Israelis still waiting. The settlers are still sitting there waiting for absolute ironclad guarantees, and won't go back because, as you're saying, the connection to the land simply is not there.
Whereas Palestinians are now saying, we will not leave again. We would rather die on our land. In fact, all the Palestinians that I hear about in Egypt are waiting to go back. I even have an aunt that got asylum in Canada, and she's waiting to go back. So this attachment and this relationship and this desire to be, where they feel they belong, I mean, there's like, just look at how we're being treated everywhere else. So better to die with dignity on your own land than to be a beggar, basically, or to be sort of disdained the way that we are here at Columbia University, for example,
And elsewhere, Hadeel. But I mean, that's a really excellent point you're making. But also, Hadeel, you've written a lot. I mean, this is a slight segue. You've written a lot. I was going to ask you about visual resistance. We'll come back to that. But you've written a lot about these extraordinary, and you've unearthed these extraordinary schemes that go back decades and decades and decades about, of course, trying to get the Palestinians out of Gaza. The Israeli schemes to depopulate Gaza, to expel, to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And you've written an extraordinary piece, a longer piece and a shorter piece in the London Review of Books. Can you just tell us a little bit more about these schemes and what do they mean to you? The fact that the Israelis have been for decades trying to get rid of the population of Gaza, and yet have failed time and again with ever more increasing levels of violence and depravity. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you discovered?
Sure. I mean, it all began with me trying to go to Gaza. It's I have another piece that I wrote on a website run by Insaniyat, the Palestinian Society of Anthropologists, called Inventory of Rejections, just documenting how many times I've tried to get into Gaza. I didn't realize it was like 9 times since 2005. And so in one of those trips, just trying to kind of, build relationships and know my family and know my community. In one of those trips, when I was not able to get in, I ended up meeting this great uncle who was actually in Jordan. And that was really how I discovered the story. I don't think I would have come across it any other way. And of course, there's many other scholars that have written about transfer schemes that have been going on for decades. But this particular transfer scheme, I think, really stuck with me just because of how secretive it was. Although, I mean, Israel has always been open about their desire to empty Gaza. But this particular scheme was initiated in 1969 in the aftermath of 1967, of Israel sort of taking on, occupying the Gaza Strip, and with it, kind of taking on the responsibility of this large Palestinian population. And they had many methods of trying to empty the population. I mean, part of it was what Sarah Roy calls de-developing the economy. So after 67, I mean, has a longer history. It happened under the British as well, but sort of, de-developing Palestinian economy, which would then drive Palestinians to search for work elsewhere, which my father went to go work in the Gulf. My grandfather went to work in the Gulf. I have a lot of relatives from Gaza that went, one uncle that went to Germany, they all had to go out to work. And for me, this is also a method of transfer. But this particular transfer scheme was a trick. They were tricked. My uncle thought he was signing up for yet another worker program in Brazil, and was taken to Paraguay instead, only to discover that there was no worker program. And you have to understand, this is a 19-year-old guy. He's a refugee. He just finished his training in, one of the UNRWA vocational schools. He's seeing people all around him go work elsewhere. So this was in the beginning, I was like, why would you fall for this? But once I understood better the context of all these other ways that Israel was trying to sort of empty out the Gaza Strip, it makes total sense that he would believe it.
Hadeel, which year was this?
1969.
69. Okay, thank you.
So in 1969 is 2 years after Israel occupies the Gaza Strip. They set up these travel agencies. One of them, this travel agency that arranged it is still operating in Tel Aviv. It's called Patra, Patra. Patra was actually created before the State of Israel, and in our attempts to interview them, we discovered that they were also participating in weapons transfers. They were participating in illegally bringing Jews over under the British Mandate period. So they have this sort of proud history of human and weapons trafficking. But for some reason, when we brought up Paraguay, they were shocked and refused to talk about it. And what I discovered in that process was that, first of all, the reason that they're not interested in talking about it is because the scheme was considered a failure. And it was not because it was a bad thing to do to people, but because it didn't succeed in meeting its objectives of sending 60,000 Palestinians from Gaza to Paraguay. And also because two other transferees in 1970 went to confront the Israeli ambassador in Paraguay, and in the process, a shooting occurred. An Israeli secretary was killed, and so there was a gag order placed over reporting or talking about any of this scheme. And the first to report on it was actually Yossi Melman and Dan Raviv, and I interviewed Yossi Melman, who was apparently serving in the military at the same time as in Gaza that the transfer scheme was happening. And so I kind of go through this whole process of trying to understand not only what role the Israeli government had, but also the role that Israeli historians and journalists had, and also maintaining this narrative and this cover-up of what actually happened.
These kinds of schemes, it just seems that there's so many attempts to try to get people out of Gaza for so many years and so many decades, as you were saying. The latest being Trump's, scheme to create the Riviera in the, along the coast, and to expel basically everybody. And then at one point he said, we'll bring people back. And then later on he said, no, actually they won't come back because they'll be settled in other places. What do you know about this Trump plan? And, and how are people reacting to that? Is it just dismissal, or are they genuinely, concerned about this, that people are going to come in and force them out again?
Also, by the way, just to tag on to this, when Trump started talking about it, you could see a light going off in Netanyahu's head. But I don't. It may have come from I mean, who knows? I mean, you've been saying. I mean, the Israelis have been talking this way for decades, so that's not new by itself. But I wonder whether it's one of the Trump's harebrained schemes that came to him, maybe from Jared Kushner or something, or did it come from Netanyahu, or is it some combination of all these kinds of things?
It's definitely Kushner, and
He's
also
Kushner, yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's a real estate deal, and it's in its purest form, and people are sort of irrelevant to that. But it's also the AI video that came out was really interesting. The way they portrayed Trump and Musk as well.
Oh, sorry. I think just it's a real estate scheme, except that he was so clear. We're not going to buy it. We're not going to pay for Gaza. We're just going to get it. So somebody else is going to give it to us. Basically, there's no transaction. We just take. Basically. Sorry, Hadeel, go ahead.
Well, I don't know if you remember in Trump's first presidency, he also posited a scheme. You know, before he actually put it on paper, there was all this talk, and I write about this in I guess my book manuscript that should be coming out one day in the future. But I talk about this time period called where people were concerned about Safqat al-Qarn, right? Like Trump's deal of the century, and people were very concerned about it at the time in both Sinai and Gaza. That Trump was going to try to put all the Palestinians in Gaza and maybe take a piece of the Sinai to extend it. And when he finally actually issued a map, the Palestinians took that map and reworked it into a middle finger, right? And they did the same thing with his AI video. I don't know if you saw the Gaza's response to the AI video, and of course so many other responses sort of making fun of the situation. But in all seriousness, beyond sort of Trump's wild ideas, there's also the reality of all these reconstruction plans that are being proposed for Gaza right now. One of them is coming from the Wilson Center. There was also one coming from UAE. UAE plan was basically the proposal is to completely wipe out Gaza, like flatten it and start from scratch. Of course, deleting, as we talked about, this millennia of history, and to recreate it in its image. So the UAE reconstruction plan is not so different from the Trump plan in terms of thinking about this as a big real estate opportunity, whereas the Palestinian reconstruction plan is called the Phoenix plan, is a very, very well thought out, detailed plan put together by the municipalities. So just to answer your question, of course nobody's taking Trump's vision seriously. At the same time, they're working very, very hard and very impressively about how to really think about not just reconstructing Gaza, but also reconstructing it in a way that's sustainable. They have things like a water taxi as an idea, like public transportation. Even now, in the interim, for example, in Rafah, some of my family is in Rafah, the municipality has parceled out land by family so that people can start coming closer, reconstructing. So like they're not waiting again, right? They're not waiting for Trump to do whatever he says he's going to do. They're not waiting for the Emirates or any of these others to come save them. They're actively reconstructing, imagining, building. So the reaction to Trump has been, both in his past presidency and now, has really just been one of ridicule.
But Hadeel, how is it possible? I'm sure, like, how is it possible for Palestinians in Gaza to reconstruct, given the ongoing siege, given the fact that the Israelis, are so horrific in the way they treat Palestinians there? They don't allow anything in. So can you just explain what does reconstruction actually mean, as best as you can tell?
Well, of course, reconstruction would require some materials to enter. There's also, even in the past reconstructions, there's a whole process by which any plan, any building that's built has to go through Israeli approval, which can take months and months to happen. And of course, it feeds into their surveillance technology in terms of all the plans of the buildings. Everything has to go through Israel. So I don't know what's going to happen this time, but of course, Palestinians are doing what they can with what they have. Like for example, in the Brazil neighborhood of Rafah. Rafah has all these different neighborhoods. One of them is called the Brazil neighborhood. Our mutual aid project, which we might talk about later, for example, has helped raise funds for them to install a water well. This is happening all over the place. They've gotten new tents that, as they're parceling the land by family. I think this particular neighborhood is serving 2,200 families. So they're making do with what they have. And you have to understand, like, Gaza is not tiny, right? I mean, it's tiny in the grand scheme of things, but it's I think like 3 or 4 Manhattans, right? It's a sizable area that had materials, had they have a lot of experience in repurposing concrete, for example. I'm trying to work with the potters there to try to think about, can we make bricks from all this clay that's, to use that as reconstruction instead of waiting for concrete. So there's always been a lot of innovation. There's always been, yeah, like I said, just this will to life and like just not waiting around. So, another thing that's very commendable about the Reconstruction plan, we had this man, Mahmoud Khalil, who's an expert in Reconstruction, give a presentation in my seminar. And one thing he mentioned was how they're rejecting the idea of like a centralized power plant or even a centralized desalination plant because they know that there could be future bombardments. So the Reconstruction even takes into account the very possible reality of future bombardments of Gaza so that all infrastructure is not dependent on a single location. So all these considerations and all these experiences are built into their vision based on their experience and their understanding of the place. Whereas, people like, groups like the Emirates and Trump are obviously imposing a very, very foreign vision that's just not viable.
So you talked about the Emirates and kind of Trump and Israeli plans to basically to remove people from Gaza, and you talked about the kind of the local ideas and visions for what reconstruction should look like. But what about the Egyptian one? I mean, we know that from when Sisi kind of came in and destroyed the in the Sinai part of Rafah, and displaced everybody there, and people were talking about that was in preparation for the possible ethnic cleansing, and that's come up several times about the Israelis and possibly the Americans wanting to push people into Sinai in that way. But we've seen this incredible reaction from Egypt and from the other Arab countries, including Jordan, others, after Trump kind of announced his plan, and they've finally gotten their act together. And in the space of days, they've managed to come up with this massive kind of reconstruction plan, just because they seem to be so scared of Palestinians being put into their own lands, as opposed to sent to Paraguay or somewhere else. What is it about? What do people think of Egypt at this point, and kind of the Egyptian role and the Egyptian-led kind of reconstruction plan? If if that's something that comes up.
I mean, in general, Gaza has always been very heavily dependent on Egypt and had a very close but complicated relationship with Egypt. Um, for example, when I've asked my elders in the past to compare Egypt's occupation of Gaza to Israel's occupation of Gaza, I was scolded for calling the Egyptian presence an occupation. So although there is, kind of a hot and cold relationship in terms of knowing that certain players in Egypt have been deeply exploiting the Palestinians, especially the Palestinians trying to evacuate, also exploiting the goods that are coming into Gaza. So there's that reality as a background, right? There's sort of this, I don't know what to call it, a love-hate relationship, a very complicated relationship that spans decades. Um, I'm not an expert in the reconstruction plans, but I do know that the Egyptian reconstruction plan did take consultation from the Palestinians. And so there was consultation between the Palestinians and the Egyptians to come up with something that would be acceptable to all parties. And if you look at the map of the Egyptian plan, it actually accounts for green spaces and agricultural spaces, whereas the Emirate plan doesn't have any of that. So, so again, I think because of this interdependence and long-standing relationship, they were able to come up with something that was acceptable to all parties in terms of meaning the Palestinians and the Egyptians and the other Arab states.
So, Hadeel, on this question, all this work that you've done, especially on all these insidious transfer schemes that have failed repeatedly over and over again, as well as all the work you've done on humanizing Gaza or reminding us of the history and the humanity and the ecology of Gaza that goes back centuries. You write at the end of your piece on the attempted expulsion of Palestinians to Paraguay. Your uncle, or is it your uncle, your great uncle?
My great uncle, yeah.
your great uncle. You end by saying that this history, this hidden history, sort of reveals the quote disingenuous concern of liberal Zionists who are nonetheless committed to the expulsion of the Palestinians, end quote. So how has the Gaza genocide reframed this sense of alleged concern? Because today it doesn't seem like there's any even pretense of concern for Palestinians. We're beyond that. So how does that Palestinian insistence on life correlate with what seems to be this extraordinary sort of liberal Zionist disappearance?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've been following Yossi Melman's Twitter, just because, I did interview him. I actually interviewed him. The first time I met him was with my mother, and my mother was like, you're on your own with this guy. Like, she couldn't even stand to sit with him because he was, just making these awful comments about Arabs this and Arabs that.
Who is he? Who is he? Could you just...
Yossi Melman is a journalist. He's written a few books. He is an Israeli journalist who is actually Polish. His family immigrated to Israel when he was, I think, 6. I forget what. So he was young. And then in the process of my interview, he acknowledges that these Palestinians were victims that fell for this Israeli transfer scheme, but that the real problem was that it was not a well orchestrated scheme. So even in his feigned concern, he's still indicating that the real problem with the scheme was that it was run by an amateur, which is this woman, Ada Sereni, who's an Italian Zionist, who didn't even speak the language, according to him, who has a history of pushing for Jewish transfer into Israel, into Palestine before it was Israel, and so was tapped after 1967 by Levi Eshkol at the time. And in Yossi Melman's mind, that was a bad decision. And again, it's not because this feigned concern for Palestinians, it's because he tells me very clearly at the end of our interview that Israel is a state for Jews. It's a democratic state for Jews, and he doesn't see a contradiction in that. And so, at the same time that he's saying this, he's also telling me that he's against the settlements, right? So he lives in Tel Aviv. He has a problem with the settlements. And so I ask him, what's the difference between settlements in the West Bank and settlements here? And he's, brushes off the question and just ready to appear like a good liberal Zionist, right? So this is somehow they're able to sit with this contradiction. But now I agree with you. I don't see that even pretense coming from his Twitter account. That he seems to be somehow deeply embedded with the government and with the military establishment that he claims not to be, but it's hard to believe that. And no concern at all indicated in his Twitter feed during this genocide. So I think, you're absolutely right that this feigned concern, or what Arish Sabah Houri describes, I think she does this so well, is this kind of like recognition and disavowal that these liberal Zionists tend to enact. And I think that process has kind of been subdued during this genocide.
Except, I would say that that's true, except among American Zionists, where there still is so many American Zionists still want to maintain the pretense that they are liberal, ethical, moral, pro-gay rights and women's rights and ecological sensitivity and racial equality and all this kind of stuff, and still reconcile themselves, not just with Zionism in general, but with apartheid and genocide, particularly because they still refuse to square that in their own head. So,
Sadi, who do you have in mind? Like in
I
contempt,
mean, like
who do you have in
the
mind?
people around us at our university campuses, for example, who are progressive and liberal on basically every topic under the sun except for Palestine.
But I don't know how they can live with this contradiction now that Trump, they're advocating and they're thanking Trump now for what he's doing.
Some, yeah, Hadeel, some, but many others still won't. And what they do, the mode that they go into is one of, if you bring up the genocide, they say, you're making me feel uncomfortable or unsafe. So they bisakru rason still, that which is in an extraordinary way. I mean, I've written a whole book about Zionist denial, and I think you're right when it comes to in occupied Palestine itself. I think like the age of the liberal Zionists is basically gone. Now they've all come out of the closet. They're all showing themselves what they always were, of course, which is genocidal, proponents of apartheid. That's not new in and of itself. The liberal pretense is gone, but here in America we still have. I mean, I'll give you an example. That, like, for example, I'm writing this review of the movie No Other Land, And just in reading what people have been saying about it in general, I saw a review in the LA Jewish Journal by some guy who's like progressive Hollywood, مش عارف شو, but obviously a Zionist, right? And what he's saying is he goes through what the movie does. I don't know if you've seen the movie yet, but it's basically it's not true. There really was a military training area. They were trying to keep the Palestinians there safe. They built these houses illegally, and he basically still perpetuates it's the same old lies, and you see them regurgitating the same old lies. So I think American liberal Zionism will still live on in a way. You're right. Many people here have shifted Zionists here have shifted to the right, but there still is. I won't call it left wing, but it thinks of itself as being progressive form of liberal Zionism here in the U.S., which is premised on absolute pig-headed refusal to acknowledge reality. Basically, it's a level of self-sustained, self-soothing ignorance that has no parallel that I'm aware of in contemporary history. So I think it still lives on, honestly, in the US as an isolated phenomenon. But I think you're right. In Palestine itself, there are no more liberal Zionists. Khalas, they're all now openly sort of, like they're like the guy in Conrad, exterminate the brutes, basically. That's the position they've taken. I think that's my sense anyway.
Yeah, and maybe I'm talking from the perspective of what we're seeing here at Columbia, where there's like these Zionist WhatsApp groups that are advocating for doxing people and getting them picked up by ICE.
Beitar, Jabotinsky's group,
That's
isn't
that's
it?
that's one group. That's the more extreme group. But even the professors here at Columbia
Yeah, there's
University.
the alumni group, right? There's that alumni
Right, there's the
WhatsApp
alumni
network.
group,
Yeah.
there's active professors and students here that are advocating for mask bans or advocating for ICE to come on campus and remove protesters. So,
Yeah, but
and I've
Hadeel, they
seen
still
them.
see themselves as the victims. And in
Absolutely.
other words, there's a kind of there's the one guy whose name I won't even mutter, there at Columbia. Like it's genocidal narcissism. It still is a form of narcissism and denial, though. It's not like the ones in Palestine who say we really have like these guys won't say we want to exterminate the Palestinians. The ones in Palestine will. The ones here still won't. They can't. Most of them still can't bring themselves. So they think of people protesting against the genocide really as Hamas secret, sleeper cells and things like that. But that's kind of they've warped them. Their minds are so warped that that's kind of how they think of the reality they're in. But I wanted to ask, just by way of wrapping, with all of the talk now of the Israelis basically breaking the ceasefire, surprise, surprise, as they have been doing in Lebanon too, of course, and trying to squirm out of continuing the ceasefire and the negotiations and so on, and now turning off the electricity and obviously retightening the siege and so forth. Do you think, first of all, we're going back to the full-blown genocide that we saw in the previous 15 or 16 months? And do you think people still have the capacity to hang on? Maybe they don't have any choice, but I just want to know what you think about that.
I hate to imagine going back to the genocide. Um, I, I think the Israelis are banking on it. I know Trump has sent weapons. Um, I don't know how to predict what's going to happen. It's very dark right now. But this talk about Israel cutting the electricity. I was talking to my cousins there, and they're saying that we haven't had electricity for a year and a half. So I think that in particular, the electricity cut was like a small amount of electricity that was going to a desalination plant. The electricity has been cut this whole time. Um, so it remains to be seen what will actually happen. I think it also remains to be seen what will happen here in terms of the level of repression. Like, if this case with Mahmoud Khalil goes unchallenged, not I mean, it's being challenged, but if it goes unchallenged, then we're all at risk, obviously. And so just we're kind of in unprecedented and unpredictable times right now. But one thing I do know for sure is that the Palestinians in Gaza, and just as the people in South Lebanon have demonstrated, they will hold on. I mean, they have many have indicated that they'd rather die here on their land rather than like many of them regretted being displaced, like leaving their land. And this is why we saw that big flow of everyone going back, because it's not it's hard, maybe it's easier for us to imagine like leaving a bombing site or leaving a war, but being a refugee and being displaced is also not there's also a question of dignity and a question of, how do you want to die? Right? I mean, I remember people talking about they like just the fact of like people wanting to gather the body parts of their people and finding their dead and burying them with dignity. Dignity is a big factor here. And so I don't imagine Palestinians in Gaza leaving again after what they experienced. So whatever happens, I do believe that they will hold on, absolutely.
Hadil, on this note, of exactly what you're saying, that Palestinians hopefully will hold on and have held on as they've done for a century, on their own land, even through displacement, they manage to hold on to where they have been displaced to, and they hold on to the memories, of course, and their claims to go back to where they are originally from. You have worked, and to end this on a more sort of hopeful note, in the sense of your whole work and your whole project is to center Palestinians, at the center of the experience of Gaza and Palestinians. Could you tell us a little bit more about this project you're involved in, a mutual aid project? What is it, and how does it work?
Sure. I mean, it really just began with me and checking on one of my great aunts who lives in Khan Yunis. She's a very devout woman, a very community committed woman. She was a corpse washer in years past, and I just started asking her. I'm also very cognizant of people's dignity, right? So I don't want to treat her like a charity case, but was just offering, is there anything I can do? And so it really began with her saying, I'm fine, but I have people displaced around me and I can distribute to them. So we started that way, like very, very small scale. And then it kind of grew very fast, as especially as people outside of Gaza were just itching for ways to help. And of course, the easiest way to help, unfortunately, is by giving money, right? As opposed to going to the streets or, taking more risky approaches. Donating was an easy way for people to contribute. And so we kind of grew into this project, Gaza Mutual Aid Solidarity. It was me, my mother, my sister, a family friend from the Ashur family. And then later we adopted a Lebanese friend who we also worked with on some initiatives in southern Lebanon. And we started just, raising funds, and all these artists kind of came out of the woodworks and did incredible creative work. Some of the work behind me, actually, these are not the pieces that were sold for our mutual aid, but they just started producing artwork. They started putting on dinners. They started hosting events. I mean, like, incredible creativity that was really actually uplifting for us in such a devastating time. It served kind of two purposes. It gave all of us a chance to feel like we were doing something. And so we were able to send funds for things like food distribution, water distribution, installing water wells, the clay ovens, of course, distribution of clay ovens, supporting schools, supporting whatever. And this is again the issue of centering Palestinians here. We were careful not to dictate to them what to do with the funds, because first of all, they're on the ground, they know what they need, and also the situation was changing so quickly, and they had to adapt. We had to adapt with them, and so we've been doing that since November 2023. And right now we're in talks with Mecca, the Middle East Children's Alliance. I have a 20-year friendship with Ziad Abbas, the executive director, just since they have more infrastructure and they have more people on the ground, about possibly like partnering with them to kind of just help be more effective, especially as things are getting more and more difficult to get in, especially now.
Well, Hadil, thank you so much for your time, for all your work, for your humanism, for your brilliance. Thank you so much for being on Makdisi Street with us today.
Thank you. It was very nice to meet your brothers.
Thank you, Hadeel. Your work is truly, truly extraordinary. It was a great pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, guys.
All right, guys, that was an extraordinary session with Hadeel Assali, anthropologist at Columbia University now, an extraordinary work on Gaza. What did you think of that conversation, Sadi?
I thought, first of all, I thought it was great, and I think her work is amazing. We'll link to at least some of her stuff in the description of the show. People should read this work because it's like the stuff on the tunnels, the stuff on the videos, the stuff on visibility and opacity, and so on. I mean, it's really, really brilliant work. It reminds us of how when anthropology is done in a really, really smart way, the work that comes out of it is amazing. And I say that as a literary person myself. So that was great. And then the conversation, what's happening. I mean, the like all the deep context to what's happening right now is so important to bring out, and that's both literally and metaphorically what her work brings to light. What did you think, Kareem? What do you think?
No, I agree with you that it's fascinating work, and I learned a lot as well from it. And it's not easy to find, such good anthropological work on the tunnels, especially, and also a reminder, of the history, of this ancient history of Gaza. That we focus so much. I mean, it's understandably so that people are so focused on the genocide and the humanitarianism and the refugee and the violence and ethnic cleansing schemes, that one forgets that there's this much larger history. So it's including the tunnels. So so I thought that was really interesting. Also, that the question of the tunnels, I was reminded that, of course, with the in 2006, when Hamas captured one of the soldiers, and they brought back Sinwar as part of that deal. So it's one of the tunnel operations that brings back Sinwar to Gaza, to who then is the one who then prepares for the wars that followed as well. So there's so much to kind of wrestle with, and I thought as well the discussions towards the end, of it. I always come back to it, the idea of the way in which the colonizer, I said, I know you've written about this too, but the way the colonizer simply doesn't have a relationship with the land in the way that the indigenous do. And it's not just a question there of erasure, but the question of they simply can't form that connection. They simply are unable to. And as I think I said earlier, in the Lebanon case as well, the Israeli settlers, even though from this side, from Lebanon's side, there's not much going on in terms of cross-border attacks. They still haven't gone back to their settlements, whereas people in the south immediately went back as far as they can. And so it's a similar kind of thing in all the regions. So people who are connected immediately go back to the land, despite genocide, despite ethnic cleansing, despite just kind of annihilation. Whereas the colonizers simply don't have that connection. I found that very interesting to kind of, it comes back in various discussions that we've had. And in this case, even discussing through the tunnels, it becomes clear.
Yeah, Osama, since you're the resident historian, give us a 1 minute synopsis of what Jabotinsky says in the Iron Wall about the indigenous Palestinians. This is important for what's going on now too, I think. Do you remember that line?
Well, yeah, I mean, Jabotinsky in 1923 writes an essay in Russian, if I'm not mistaken, in which he basically says that the only way that obviously the Palestinians are native, he admits that in the way that the extreme right in Israel often does, in the sense of they admit that the Palestinians are indigenous, but that no compromise can be made with them until they're crushed, until they give up all hope, and they're crushed by this thing that he calls, this metaphor that he calls the iron wall. In other words, the idea of crushing the will of Palestinians, first through British mandatory bayonets, but then, of course, and through the British colonial presence, but then through the Zionist settler colonial presence as well. After 1948, I mean, he wrote this in 1923, though he was anticipating what was going to happen later, and this idea of crushing hope, and only when you crush people's hope and they're in despair of any form of resistance, only then can you dictate terms and have it be called a settlement. And that's what's so interesting about what Hadil's, and also just everything we've seen over the last 15
But also,
months.
Sama Ben Gurion also says the same later, doesn't he? A similar kind of thing, that you need to crush the hope. No, in other words, it's on the so-called liberal, Labor Party side as well. It's on all strands of
Oh,
Zionism
well,
have that.
Jabotinsky wasn't on the liberal side. The guy was.
Yeah, Jebeli was on the liberal side, but the point is, of course, I mean, Ben Gurion was of course the implementer of all these visions in the Nakba of 1948 and what comes afterwards. But the point of Hadil's work is that it reminds us again of first of all, again, as we've just said, the humanity of the Palestinians, the history of the Palestinians, and also their connection to the land, and as opposed to, but Seti, your whole work, I mean, let's not belabor this point too much, but your whole work is also about the way, working with Patrick Wolf and other scholars, this whole idea of how the whole project of Zionism in Palestine is about erasing the native and then claiming a kind of nativity, an indigeneity in place of, right? Isn't that what the whole project
Or
is all
in
about?
relation to, no, isn't in relation to.
In relation to, or just in denial of. I don't know.
That's why I raised Jabotinsky, because he says it. I was trying to find the line. He says it. The Arab thinks of his relation to the soil in the same way that the Aztec does to his Mexico and the Sioux does to his prairie. Like this is the point, is that he recognizes they are the indigenous people. They have the succession to the land. We are the colonizers. The amazing thing today is that some, not all, but there's a sort of strand in Zionism today, the kind of the lunatic fringe, that insists on themselves, that they say they are the indigenous people returning to their ancient homeland, this kind of stuff. And like, if you read the early Zionists, Weizmann and Jabotinsky and these others, Herzl himself, and so on, Ben Gurion, etc., it's clear, like they were very clear that they were the colonizers, and But to come back to this point about the people in the land, I mean, it's not just the people in the settlements in the north, Karim. It's also the 600,000 Israelis who've left during the past year and a half. Like, that point came up in our discussion with Salman Abu Sitta. Remember, a year, whatever, we had that discussion more than a year ago now on this podcast. That that you can see the attack. You could tell who's the indigent and who's the colonizer just by the relation to the land itself.
But also, Sadi, there's also this sense as well, is there not, of how Palestinians and I would say Arabs more generally, Lebanese and others, are acutely aware of what happened in 1948. I mean, there's the history of, we don't want a Nakba again. We're not going to get up and leave. I mean, without blaming, of course, in no way is anyone blaming what happened in 1948. In other words, the people fleeing for their lives. That sort of, nobody can tell anyone that you shouldn't be concerned and afraid. But people are so acutely aware of the idea of, if you leave, you're not going to come back. Especially when Trump says you're not coming back. And Trump is so vulgar. He says these things, right? He says it openly. You're not coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I still want to come back to this thing about American Zionism today, because I think by and large it still refuses to openly endorse the project of genocide. It still will slip and slide and contort itself, and come up with hair splitting and all kinds of obfuscation to deny that that's what's actually going on. So this whole thing about, you're making me feel uncomfortable, you're making me feel unsafe, is all to deny. It's to forestall. It's to say, I can't look. I don't know what's going on there. I want to reaffirm my own morality, my own ethical stance, on my own humanity, and so on and so forth, in a narcissistic way, while absolutely refusing to acknowledge what's actually happening, allegedly in my name, in Gaza or elsewhere in Palestine. I think it's truly extraordinary. I don't think we've seen such an act of self-bewitching for so long in the face of the manifest truth. It's extraordinary to me.
Just
But
one
anyway,
other point.
yeah.
Just one other point, which because we discussed it at length as well in the discussion, is this idea that you have people besieged in a genocidal kind of assault on Gaza. You have all these fighters, resistance fighters, who are sitting in these tunnels, kind of popping up and trying to do what they can. And then you have everybody in the world involved in either wanting to ethnically cleanse them. We've seen the American plan, the Trump plan. We've seen the
Everyone in the West.
Every
no,
government.
and
Be
some
careful,
Arab
not
countries,
people.
And the Arab
and
and some Arab
Yeah, but
states
it's
that are
governments,
complicit.
it's not people.
Some Arab states. No, of course not people. Okay, so you have this kind of a tension. You have an Emirati plan, you have an American plan, you have an Egyptian plan now, and sort of an Arab League type plan. There's everybody is involved in this thing, and yet everybody, again, of course, talking about states here, everybody is part and parcel of this ethnic cleansing enterprise, and still, despite all that, people in Gaza are still want to choose to stay put as much as possible. Of course, there's people who will leave and who want to leave, and I fully understand that. But as a whole, people are also, as far as I know, are choosing to stay. It's a really, and it's very difficult to understand it. I mean, one can sort of think about it, but very, very difficult to understand that choice in a genocide, with all these countries working very hard to get people out. That choices can still be made to stay on the ground. It's really extraordinary.
Okay, on that note, thank you guys, and especially thank you to Hadeel.
Yeah, she was fantastic, and we'll connect some of her work in the description.
And the mutual aid, I think we'll put the link to mutual aid as well.
Good idea. Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye bye.